Join the conversation.
Join the conversation.
You're with Cape Talk.
35 minutes after 9 o'clock, and you're on Views and News with myself, Saskia Falcon, standing in for Clarence Ward. Of course, it is Friday, which means it is time with us to get this wonderful time with the naked scientist. Dr. Chris Smith, lecturer at the University of Cambridge, will answer all of your weird and wonderful sciencey questions. Happy Friday to you, and happy Human Rights Day.
Happy Friday, Saskia. Good to see you. And I can see
Very
you as
good
well. It's
to
very nice because I can see you, but you can't see me today. So
I can't see you.
no, well, there's no camera in this studio, so I can see you. I have this bird's eye view of you, but I'll work on that for next time.
Well, I'll try to keep it nice then.
Yeah.
So we've got tons of questions for you today, Dr. Chris. I think we're going to start off with this one, which says, can we utilize minerals in mineral water, or can only things like earthworms do that? They can eat dirt, they can provide food for plants. We can't eat dirt. So why should we be able to? Can we not get minerals? And he says from ricks in water, but I think that might be a typo, and that comes from Anthony out in Clippieville.
Hello, Anthony. When you drink the water, you're drinking the water not for the minerals, really. You're drinking the water for the water. And when they say mineral water, it's crafty marketing for the most part, because this is water that's come out of the ground from certain appointed, tested, presumed to be safe places. And yes, it will have a particular combination of minerals in it which have dissolved as the water filters through the ground. Some of those things will impart different flavours and textures even to the water when it goes into your mouth. So it will affect your experience of it, and that's why it's sold as a sexy brand, this mineral water. But actually, the concentration of those minerals is pretty low, and that's what food is for, to be perfectly honest. We get most of our nutrition, most of the things that we need to keep our bodies in balance, you get from food. When you drink water, you're mainly going for the water, the clues in the name, and that keeps you hydrated. So don't look to mineral water for the majority of your minerals. Look to the food for that. But in some parts of the world, people don't have access to mineral water. They have access to whatever groundwater is there. And if it's contaminated, then those minerals and contaminants in that water can be dreadfully bad for them. And there are some parts of the world where, for various reasons, mining can do this, natural disasters can do this. You get things brought up from deeper within the earth or spread onto the surface of the earth that then filter into the water through rainfall and floods and so on. And so there can be things in there that can be extremely bad for us. Arsenic is one example. Selenium is another example. So it's not a given that because it says mineral, it's healthy. There are some minerals that are really, really, really bad for us. But what normally comes out of a bottle of mineral water is mostly water with a few salty bits dissolved in it from the rocks that the water was in.
Just on the topic of water then, I've got another question in here from 2D saying, can Dr. Smith clarify whether keeping water in a plastic bottle in the fridge can be carcinogenic? Because we do know that these plastics can leach into the water when it's heated.
We've just published a programme on the naked scientists, actually, and we called it the misgivings about microplastics, because we've just looked at this very question, not just in humans, but also there was a dramatic paper out from Australia last week on seabirds, where they've actually gone and got blood samples and stomach contents from bird chicks. So these are birds that are being fed by what their parents bring back from them, from their own diet, and they're able to tie the burden of plastic in the bird to the changes in the bloodstream of various markers, including inflammatory markers, functions of how they, or markers of how the nervous system is working, signs of inflammation in the stomach, for example. They show a strong correlation between plastic burden and ill health or lower quality of growth in these birds. So that points towards there being a concern. And in humans, we have associative data. We can't prove that anything causes anything really at this stage. We're looking at the association between exposure to certain chemicals and the risk of developing certain diseases later, but it's really, really tough to tie them causally together at this stage. So no one's done that yet. Now, the concern about plastics is that they are everywhere. We've made hundreds of millions of tons of them since plastics were first invented. And as one person put it to me, Richard Thompson, who I spoke to this week, he 20 years ago coined the term microplastics. And he put it very well when he said, we don't know that plastics are everywhere, but everywhere we've looked, we find them. these microplastic particles. And another paper in a journal from last year showed that when people took a bottle of mineral water off the shelf in a supermarket, they found thousands of plastic particles in the water when the bottle hadn't even been opened. So in other words, there's ubiquity of exposure. These particles are everywhere. What we don't know is the direct impact on our health of those particles. There are going to be physical effects. You've got things going into you that shouldn't be in you. We know they get across the wall of the intestine. We know they go around in the bloodstream. People are even finding them in the brain, in the placenta of developing babies, in the walls of arteries, even in seminal fluid. So we know they're going everywhere. We also know they get out of the body to an extent as well, but some don't. But do they have an effect when they're there? Tempting to speculate, because we see them at sites of disease, like arterial disease, like Alzheimer's disease. Maybe they are involved in the disease process.
Yes.
Or on the other hand, because that part of the body is damaged already, perhaps it's just a natural place for these particles to collect. So that is the uncertainty at the moment. As to carcinogenicity, there are certain chemicals added to the plastics which leach out of the plastic and into the thing that the plastic is holding. And when you have an old plastic bottle and it goes all brittle, the reason it's gone brittle is because the plasticizers that were in the bottle to make it have the nice texture have gone. Where have they gone? They've gone into you because you've drunk them all.
Oh, no.
We don't know, though, what the consequences long-term for our health are. So we are watching this very closely.
Dr. Smith. I'm immediately putting all of my water into glass. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. On a different note now, completely, I just spoke to our state veterinarian about the outbreak of rabies in our Cape fur seal population. And she pretty much said it's there to stay now. Now they just watch it. Somebody wants to know what happens to a shark if he eats a seal with rabies. Will the shark get infected? I know that the doctor said that mammals are the ones that get infected with rabies. But can you clarify a little bit more?
Viruses are really specific about the hosts that they prey on. So you'll have viruses which infect certain species but can't infect other species. There are even viruses that prey on bacteria, and you could inject those into a human and they couldn't get into our cells because they are so well optimized for targeting bacterial cells. Rabies is the same. It's very well optimized for, and it uses markers on the surfaces of our cells for the virus to grab hold, like molecular grappling hooks, to the surface of our cell. And once it gets hold of the cell, then machinery kicks in to push the virus and its genetic material inside the cell. Now, if the right coupling isn't there between the virus and the cell surface, the right viral Velcro, it cannot get in, therefore it cannot infect. So animals that are very different won't have the right sorts of markers on them to make them susceptible to infection. Sharks are evolutionarily very old species. They were around hundreds of millions of years before mammals evolved. Therefore, although we have many similarities with them because we're all related, all life on Earth is related, they are so distantly related to mammalian forms that the markers on our cells and the machinery running inside our cells that the rabies viruses, these are called lysoviruses, rely on to grow, are so different that they can't exploit. Fish, and sharks are fish, therefore they are not susceptible to infection by this class of viruses.
Very, very fascinating. All right. From Alison. Alison says, Dr. Chris, I've read recently that aspirin can assist in preventing or slowing down certain cancers. What is the current thinking on this?
This is absolutely true, Alison. Aspirin is the most amazing drug, if you think about it. It was invented by Felix Hoffmann, who worked for Bayer in the early 1900s. He was looking for a more gastro-friendly painkiller for his dad, who had bad arthritis. And his dad had been using salicylic acid, which is related to the stuff we get from willow tree bark. And it does have very good anti-inflammatory properties, but it's extremely erosive and corrosive to your stomach, gives people ulcers and everything. So Felix Hoffmann made some chemical manipulations to it and came up with something much, much kinder for the stomach. That was acetyl salicylic acid, otherwise known as aspirin, and it became the world's first trademark drug. And it made Bayer Pharmaceuticals, until the war and they broke up those German industries, a fortune. And it's stayed since as one of the world's most popular painkillers, and it's everywhere. And rather than just killing pain, we've discovered as time's gone on, it doesn't just have anti-inflammatory properties, it appears to have anti-cancer properties and even anti-dementia properties. And that actually is because all those things are linked by inflammation. And we now know that Alzheimer's disease has an inflammatory component that may drive the progression of that disease. And if you have antioxidants or anti-inflammatories like aspirin, you can slow down, apparently, the rate at which this can occur. Certain cancers occur much less frequently in people using aspirin, and other cancers come back less often in people who take aspirin. There's been quite a lot of study on colon cancer, and if people are put on aspirin in the aftermath of a diagnosis and treatment for colon cancer, their risk of recurrence of their colon cancer is lower. And this is because we're coming round to the idea that cancers, yes, cancer is a genetic disease where genes have broken and cells lose the normal controls over their growth. But there are people we found in the population who have the same genetic changes, but one of them does have cancer, one doesn't. And what separates them is the one with cancer has more inflammation going on, which seems to drive the growth. So if you take away the inflammation, you reduce the risk of cancer initiation and progression. So there is an increasing school of thought now that that aspirin can be a very valuable adjunct to some cancers, both in stopping prevention, in stopping occurrence, but also stopping recurrence.
So people can just be taking aspirin. Like, I mean, I don't want people now to go out there and be taking an aspirin a day.
No,
like
the
a
evidence we have
multivitamin.
is that in the same way that if you have a deficiency of something, you can
Right.
take something to address that deficiency, but if you take more of that thing, you may have a side effect and it may be worse for you. So don't do something you don't need. But if there's a higher risk, if the risk benefit balance is shifted in favour of this will be beneficial to you, because no drug is without side effects. And some people have famously said, if aspirin got invented tomorrow, it would never get a license to be used because the side effect profile would be too dangerous.
Right.
It would be regarded as too harmful. It causes stomach ulcers, it can cause kidney problems, it can cause other issues in the body. And so people wouldn't license it in this era, but actually it turns out it's an amazing drug in many ways. So it's a price worth paying if your risk of the things it can address makes it worth taking.
All right, let's look at the next one. Keith says, Chris, I watched a program last night about sword swallowing. How do they do it without cutting some organs?
Yeah, I had a guy do this in front of me in a radio studio. He was over doing part of a tour with the, I think he was over for the Cambridge Science Festival. It was about 15 years ago. And I always thought it was a bit of a trick, but this guy stood there in front of me in this studio, pulled out a massive great sword and tilted his head back and down it went. And
Right.
and I said, well, how on earth do you do this? And he said, well, carefully was his answer. But basically, if you tilt your head back and get the angle right, then you do end up with almost a straight line between your mouth, the back of your throat, your esophagus, and then the bottom of the esophagus. And the sword ends up at roughly the point where your esophagus, the food pipe, joins your stomach. If you carried on any further, things could get tricky. And I said to him, have you ever had any problems doing this? And he said, well, there was one time, because he didn't just stop at one sword. He actually had more than one going. And he said, well, I had a parrot that I used to have in my act. And one day the parrot was sort of perched on my shoulder and the parrot made some noise. And he said, it caught my attention and made me turn my head a bit to the side. And he said, I felt a sort of pinching down in my midriff. And he did end up in hospital for that. I think he had nicked his insides. I think he got fixed up, obviously, because he was all right telling me this story later. But I think he's as he said, he follows his own advice these days, and he does it very carefully and takes care not to be put off or make additional movements when the swords are in place.
All right, looking at the next question, and we're actually back to plastics. So, Viv wants to know the plastic bottles that say made with plants. What's that about? Is that
Right, okay.
plastic? Is that safe?
The plastic that we have hitherto called plastic and we make from hydrocarbons are polymers, which are made from oil-based materials. But there are other polymers that nature makes which have many similar characteristics, but they are, unlike the plastics that come from oil, biodegradable because nature made them. Therefore, nature has in its tool chest tools that will degrade them and break them apart. Problem with them is they're not as good at doing what we want plastics to do as the synthetic oil-based alternative or original. So what people tend to do is to produce materials that have a proportion of the material is the new stuff, environmentally friendly stuff, but there might be a sort of skeleton of the old things. And you used to be able to see this quite a lot with plastic bags, because if you had a plastic bag you kept for a long time, it would fall apart, especially in sunshine, because these plant-based materials are very easily degraded by ultraviolet light, which will hit the bonds between the chemicals and make them fall apart. It's what nature does. But you'll get your bag falling into a sort of skeleton of its former self, because the bits that are the non-oil-based plastic fall apart more and faster and first, leaving the oily based bits behind. So you will actually see that effect. So there are some products that are based entirely on these artificial, sort of much more nature-kind plastics. I'm using the word artificial for plastic being the original oil-based form, but there are many where it's a proportion. In the same way as we're adding ethanol to petrol, for example, we're not replacing petrol with ethanol completely. We're making it, say, 15% ethanol, 85% original oil-based petrol. It still has an environmental benefit, but it's not the whole hog. And so there's a range of ways of doing this, but they are basically polymers made from plants and other materials which have many of the characteristics of plastic, but crucially break down more readily, and that makes them more environmentally friendly because they're not going to be there for hundreds of years.
Tudi wants to know, so it's not the same with glass then. If we're storing our beverages in glass, that's the best.
No, Tudi, you're all right with glass. The guys who first invented glass a couple of thousand years ago, the Romans were using lots of beautiful glass. They had the right idea. Glass is silicon dioxide, and it is not going to produce microparticles in the same way that plastic does. We don't believe there are negative consequences for health from glass bottles. Plastics, there are things leaving the plastic and getting into the things that the plastic's in contact with, and that we think is the worry. But used responsibly and used carefully, plastics are an amazing material, and they enable us to do stuff we would never be able to do normally. So we just have to use them responsibly and be aware of these potential risks. And in that way, we hopefully will achieve a better balance.
Lee wants to know, please ask Dr. Smith about bottles that say BPA approved.
That stands for bisphenol A. I mentioned earlier that when you have a bottle and it becomes brittle as it gets older, and it embrittles, because when you make a plastic bottle, you don't just put plastic in the plastic bottle. Between the strands of the molecules in the polymer, you embed other molecules that are a bit like putting a layer of oil on a surface to make it slippery. And in this way, it makes the fibres or the molecular change slide around each other more readily. Right. So it gives the bottle its characteristic. When you have that nice smooth feel to the plastic and it bends and then recoils in that nice way, it makes it very pleasant to use. When that bottle goes brittle, it's because all those other things that you've slotted in there between the molecules, when they have left the premises because they've leached out largely into you if you've drunk the water or eaten the food that was in there, gone into the environment, then you see just the behaviour of the plastic. And that would be what the bottle would be like if those chemicals weren't there. Now, bisphenol A is one such chemical. It's a plasticizer. It's a chemical added to plastic to change its characteristic and make it better for certain applications. The problem is that it is free to escape over time, and it does, and there's some evidence linking this molecule to a process called endocrine disruption, because some of these molecules look like the same molecules that give us our sex characteristics, estrogen and testosterone. They have hormonal effects. So when they get into your body, because they look a bit like, or they're capable of docking with the same receptors in the body that our hormones do, they can fool the body into thinking it's had a bigger dose of estrogen than it has, or has had estrogen when it shouldn't, for example. And this can play havoc with end organs that are sensitive to those particular hormone signals. And so that's been one of the concerns. So this stuff is still used in some respects and for certain applications, but when we've got food contact with plastics, for example, because of that concern, plastics in those circumstances are mostly, they don't use these particular chemicals that are known to have these effects if they're going to have contact with the human food chain.
My goodness gracious. We're inside of The Naked Scientist with Dr. Chris Smith on Views and News. Of course, this happens every single Friday. I think we've got time for one more question, and this one comes from Gordon. Hi, Saskia. Please ask the doctor about metformin. Is it good?
Hi, Gordon. Metformin is a drug we've known about for decades, and it was introduced to help people with diabetes. And it's actually very good for helping you to control your blood sugars if you have type 2 diabetes. This is the so-called maturity onset, as we used to call it, diabetes. Diabetes that is associated with higher than normal levels of insulin, but an insensitivity to that insulin. And this is normally associated with being overweight, but not exclusively so. And so metformin can help to regulate the production of insulin and how the body responds to that insulin around the body. But we're also finding that it can also do other things. And one of the amazing things about the pharmaceutical industry now is because we're collecting electronic medical records on millions of people, we can begin to ask questions like, when we take a group of patients who are on a drug for something, do we find that they have other conditions occurring less frequently than they otherwise would, given all things being equal? And so you can find that some drugs have off-target beneficial effects treating other conditions that you didn't originally make the drug for. And metformin is finding a use in some of those circumstances, in other use cases, in heart conditions and so on, often with totally different mechanisms. So yes, it's proving to be quite a useful drug, and it's very well used, very widely used around the world.
Thank you so much for that. And with that, we say our goodbyes to you on this Friday, and we wish you a wonderful and pleasant weekend.
Yeah, have a lovely weekend, everyone, and see you next time.
See you next time, of course. Dr. Chris Smith, The Naked Scientist. This is Views and News on Cape Talk.
Join the conversation.
Join the conversation.
You're with Cape Talk.